Right. Well, thank you, Evgeny, for being with us. It's a pleasure for us to have you with us. This is an event that we've been planning a lot, and as you will see, there is a lot of interest in your podcast and a lot of different reactions between our different communities. So I will explain how are we gonna do this. First of all, we have created a panel. So I will introduce you the members of the panel. We have Paul Pangaro, that is the president of the American Cybernetics Society. Alena Leonard, who is the president of Metaphorum and ex-president of the American Cybernetics Society and Stafford Beer's partner. We have Peter Tudeman, that is an ex-president of the International Society of System Sciences and one of the members of the Metaphorum Steering Committee. We have Jonathan Randall, that is the secretary from the British Cybernetics Society. And we have Markus Schwaninger, that is a professor from St. Gallen Business School in Switzerland, representing the World Organization of Systems and Cybernetics. And we have James Fox, who is a member of the Metaphorum, a PhD in cybernetics, and he's gonna be our secretary. He's gonna be helping us to manage the time, and he's helping us to facilitate conversations. The way that we have organized this event is we're gonna have about 30 minutes to listen to you if you want. If you don't all the time, you can just tell us a little bit about the way that you develop the podcast and the main issues that you would like to highlight. And then we will have the panel. We have a list of questions that we will be doing. Peter Tudeman is going to be facilitating some of the questions, and the rest of us will be doing it in turns. Peter, could you explain, please, the rules of the game in terms of why the participants are not talking and the way of communicating with the panel?
Sure. Yes, welcome everyone to this unique event. Welcome, Evgeny. We're very pleased to welcome you. We have a large number of people here. We have a lot of different organizations represented. We are having the panel that has their video and audio on, and the participants do not. We are asking that if you have a question for the panel or for Evgeny, to please put it in the chat, which will come to the panelists, and then we will ask those questions as they are put into the chat at the appropriate time. So.
Okay, thank you, Peter. So I think that we will start by well, basically welcoming Evgeny and inviting him to tell us a little bit about the podcast. I think that all of us who are here have listened to the podcast and are full of questions. So it will be very interesting to listen from you a little bit your overall view on the podcast and how do you feel about it, and then we will begin with the questions. Okay?
Sure. I'm happy to start if the time is right. Well, thank you so much to all of you for joining and for the organizers for putting it together. I've interviewed some of you, and belated thanks again for taking part in the interviews. I think I would quibble only with the title of the session, where the Santiago Boys is presented as the Cybersyn podcast. I don't think that was ever my intent to do the definitive story of Cybersyn. It's a Cybersyn podcast, I guess, but as you may have seen, I didn't even put Cybersyn in the title or the subtitle. So I clearly think that there are other narratives as well in the podcast, right? So I'm more than happy to focus on the Cybersyn part, which is the main story, but it's not the only story in the podcast. So maybe to get us all on the same page about how this podcast came about, which would also explain many of the narrative choices and framing decisions that I've made. I'll tell you a little bit about the background of it. So by training, I'm a historian of science. I have a PhD in history of science from Harvard. I did work quite a bit on the history of cybernetics there. I worked extensively with Peter Gallison. So my training is mostly as a historian. So I did work in the archives. I visited more than 30 of them in different places. That, however, proved to be of not much help, or as much help as I thought or hoped when I took on this project. I took it on in part because I was approached by a number of, I live in Italy, so I was approached by a number of Italians who mostly working in the kind of book publishing, film, in journalism intersection, and who have formed a podcasting company, and who are looking for interesting stories with something to tell and to teach to the world, and with dramatic potential that in a way could be told to audiences that are not just niche, but also kind of big general audiences with potential to eventually be transformed into a film or a series. I don't want to go into the economics of how such projects are financed, but in my case, it proved to be quite an expensive undertaking, which still hasn't really been covered or paid off. So essentially, we ended up self-financing it in the hopes of later doing something with the product that came out of it. So it's not as if there was a grant the way academics normally work. You know, you write a proposal, you get a grant, and then once the funding institution agrees on the conditions, you're free to pursue it any way you want. That wasn't our case at all. And just to give you an example, when we started this 2 years ago, the podcasting market was booming. You had companies like Spotify investing $1 billion a year into the creation and the funding and the commissioning of podcasts. By the time I finished the podcast, this market didn't exist. So Spotify no longer funds or commissions new content, and as a result, neither do Apple or Amazon. So it just gives you a little bit of how the context of production affects many of the, I don't want to say editorial decisions, but packaging decisions and framing decisions. So I was working in a context that was completely new to me. I've never worked in that part, if you will, of the storytelling industry. So I had to learn a lot as I took it on. So that explains why, instead of taking 3 or 4 months, as we all originally expected, the podcast took 2 years, and it took several hundred, well, 200 plus interviews, and it took a lot of writing and rewriting. And I think in the first year of work, the reason why I spent so much time on refining and rewriting and generating a storyline that nobody at the end was satisfied with is because ultimately I couldn't find a dramatic way to tell the story. And as I discovered that drama has its own logic, and the story, and this logic is different from the conventional logic that drives, let's say, a historical article that you see in an academic journal or an academic monograph written by a historian. And everything that I was doing for the first 12 months had that academic flavor to it, where after some of the people who were brought on as consultants to my project, many of them with background in screenwriting and drama and film, just told me that they didn't see anything happening in the first 3 or 4 episodes. And as intellectually exciting as it was to me, and probably to most of you, with stories and backgrounds and genealogies showing all the influences on, I don't know, Stafford beer, of various strands of cybernetic thinking before that. And, you know, I've done a lot of interviews about Norbert Wiener and the Macy conferences and the biological computer lab. And ultimately, we just couldn't find a way to insert that genealogical background into the story without risking to lose a good chunk of the audience. And that was never a concern to me once before I took it on, but I understood that ultimately people who work in this and try to tell the stories to a bigger public, their main criteria for sort of deciding how to tell the story is how many people they're going to lose based on each of the narrative choices that they're making. So they start on the assumption that there is a big public and the big audience, and then every move they take ultimately is assessed also through that lens, which you might think is trivial and banal, but ultimately those were the conditions in which I was working in, because ultimately it's not a government grant or a philanthropy funded project. It's still has to be judged somehow by the market out there. So in my case, after a year of trial and error and of spending far more time than I thought, I took a pause and dedicated 3.5 months to going through a lot of books on dramatic storytelling and character development. And I went through a lot of classical books that people writing screenplays read when they tell stories. That definitely helped to bring a lot of these narratives that I wanted to tell into a more coherent story. That to some of you may have come at a cost that would seem too high, because in some sense I had to, for example, front load the podcast with the story of Salvador Allende, which, if you think about it as a story of Project Cybersyn, it might not be the right narrative move, because ultimately, why waste the whole first episode on that and only introduce Stafford Beer at the end when I could have just started with Stafford Beer himself? Those were all carefully considered and deliberated decisions, which again I had to make in charge of in light of what kind of interpretation of that period I want to make. The fact that the coup anniversary was coming up, and that would be the main narrative kind of entry point for a lot of the media and journalists writing about the podcast, clearly affected some of those decisions. So it was not just a story of Project Cybersyn that could be told in 2015 or 2005. It was a story told in 2023, which was the 50th anniversary of the coup, which basically required me trying to build some sympathy and empathy and rapport between the audience and the listeners in Salvador Allende, which I definitely wasn't expecting to do when I took this on. I definitely wasn't expecting to go and read every single Salvador Allende biography in English and Spanish and other languages that was on the market, and talk to his assistants who were still alive. And then one of the last interviews I did, which we never used on the podcast, was a 3.5-hour interview with his former secretary, Patricia Espejo, for example. That provided a lot of context, but that was the kind of decision that I clearly did not envision making at the start. So a lot of this framing and narration was affected, right, by me also discovering new themes and new connections and new ways to bring the story of that period relevant and make it kind of shed light on the challenges that we're facing today. I again also didn't fully, I mean, you know the story of Cybersyn and you've listened to the podcast, so I wouldn't go into a lot of details, but we know, for example, that Corfu, the institution from which Project Cybersyn emerged, we know quite a lot about the sort of the technicalities of how they were managing the companies that were being nationalized, and about the sectorial committees that were involved, and about the need to build a system of some kind for managing them at scale. That story, I think, has been told quite well, so I didn't even focus on it that much in the podcast. But the broader economic and technological and political ideology driving it, that has to do with kind of the influence of import substitution, industrialization, or CEPAL, a very important institution in Santiago, or dependency theory as a group of thought and as a school of thought that also affected the need to actually nationalize enterprises and then run them from the state with a longer term development strategy, that wasn't clear to me when I started. So the importance of this ideological package that sought to essentially reconquer the leading industries and reconquer the leading technologies and integrate them into the state to reduce dependency on the foreign providers of those technologies and infrastructures, that wasn't clear to me when I started. It became much clearer to me when I ended. And in the end, I think that that part of the legacy to which Cybersyn furnished the software, right? But it furnished the software to an ideological program. That program is still quite relevant today, right? It's relevant today, and that's the reason why I think my trip across Latin America, which just ended on Sunday, I was in Brazil and Chile and Argentina, it had a tremendous success, because when I go to Brazil and I present the podcast and I talk about it and I talk about the dependency theory, they immediately grasp it, because the discussions they are having about the dependence on artificial intelligence companies or cloud computing companies are not very different from the discussions that a lot of the economists and engineers were having in the Allende administration in 1970 or 1971, right? And that what necessitated the takeovers of many of the enterprises and their integration into the state economy. So one can quibble, of course, and say that that part of the story is not at all relevant to Cybersyn, and to some extent, maybe it's not. That's why I felt that I could use the story of Cybersyn as an entry point into stories which I found in the end have a stronger connection to the present without sort of downgrading and losing sight of Cybersyn itself. So, you know, in the end, I think this is, again, a completely normal way to do history. You know, all history is told from the vantage point of today, and it's being told in the it's through the vantage point of the problems perceived by the historian. And in my case, I've written about Silicon Valley and big tech and the power of technology corporations, and that part of the story has always been very dear to my heart. And looking at the Allende years, that was clearly an element that resonated with the challenges of today. So Cybersyn offered an entry point into it. I think within the dramatic constraints that I had, of having to think about intrigue and suspense, and without having to overboard or waterboard the listener with too many technical details that they probably, many of them who have no technical background, wouldn't survive. I think I did it justice in a way, but I understand that some of you might disagree. And the discussion I think that's worth having is just how much I could have pushed into a more technical direction, and a direction that would be much more focused on Project Cybersyn itself, without alienating a good chunk of the public, and without necessarily losing the ability to connect to the kind of meta discussion that's happening about Allende's legacy this year. So I've made some choices. We can argue and quibble about them, and I'll be more than happy to discuss it. At the end of the day, you know, my philosophy and guiding philosophy on this was that a podcast is a starting point, and if people are drawn into the story, they will be able to make their own way to resources like Metaphorum, or to Wikipedia, or to any other videos or lectures of Stafford Beer and his books, and the books and works of his followers and disciples. And in that sense, I really saw it as my task to sort of serve this opening to the widest audience possible. Because I don't think that, given all the limitations of the format, I could have, how should I put it? I don't think that I could have offered more than just some kind of an enticing appetizer, and the main dish would need to be served somewhere else. Again, if you think that I could have served the main dish, and it would still be the public that would be as large as it ended up being. I mean, again, I'm more than happy to debate and disagree about that, but that's also why I built the website, right? So the podcast, it's not just the audio episodes that you hear on Spotify, it's also all the additional footnotes and sources and pointers and episode backgrounders that provide additional information. Just because I've been understaffed and already we overextended the scarce resources that we had, we did not manage to transcribe and publish all of the interviews that we've done by the launch of the podcast, but we're still hoping to do that in the months or weeks to come. So with that online, I think the intellectual universe around the podcast is much wider than the 9 episodes. And the people who listen to the episodes will hopefully go to the website and check out the episode backgrounders, and will check out the footnotes, and will eventually make their way to other resources and kind of arrive at a more complex picture, which will be much richer in concepts and ideas. So on my end, again, just to reiterate something I have already said several times, the objective has been to tell the story in a way that a mainstream audience will not find boring, and that they will be able to relate to, and that they will feel kind of passionate about. I think to some extent I've probably succeeded if you look at the media reactions to the podcast. On the other hand, there was always to be an afterlife of some kind for this podcast, and if all goes well, it will inspire film or series, and I've been talking to a number of people in the film industry about that, and ultimately that would be for me, the continuation of the strategy that I've just outlined in the last 4 or 5 minutes. I mean, the podcast is an entry point. You can then have another entry point, which will reach even more people. But ultimately, the trade-off here is how much you accept to dramatize and what some of you might describe as trivialize the story in order to expose the largest number of people to it, and then have them go and discover these resources on their own. So on their own, the perfectionist answer and response to this, namely that the story could have had everything else, the story of Stafford Beer's career after Chile, the full exposition of the viable systems model, the explanation of kind of the cybernetics and management cybernetics as a discipline, and contain all of the other dramatic elements that make a pretty long podcast, which it lasts almost 10 hours, into a digestible read. I just don't think that perfectionist vision to some extent is justified by evidence. I mean, at least I've tried 12 different versions of the script, starting with a very front-loaded, heavy exposition of cybernetics and cybernetic theory, and explaining a lot of the background of Stafford Beers, where I have a whole episode on the British steelmaking industry, because I did interview people who worked with Stafford after at United Steel. And I was more than happy to, I found a lot of audio clips from British steel companies from early 1950s, and I had a very good exposition of the work that Stafford was doing there. When my Italian colleagues listened to it, they just couldn't understand why I would dedicate an hour to the intricacies of British steelmaking, right? So again, I know that for some of you that might be a capital offense, but they come from the world that sells and makes films for Netflix, right? And then the tricky position in which I found myself in is to what extent I would be able to maintain a certain degree of seriousness and explain that it was not just something eccentric, but there was real substance to these ideas, and they mattered, and there were debates about them, and there was a little bit of tragedy, I think, involving the unpredictable nature of the Chilean bureaucracy itself, which kind of crashed or clashed with the idealistic vision of the project. I tried to communicate all of that. To what extent I could have done it better and still maintain all of the extra constraints imposed on me by the format, the genre, and the need to eventually do something with this immense cost that we have accumulated in 2 years of work. that's an open question, right? Again, I'm biased. The still thing I did an okay job for a first-time podcast, which I discovered later on. Its true genre is narrative nonfiction. So there are people working in the genre, but it's a genre that's very, very difficult to work in because you're starting with true stories where you cannot dramatize. Because normally when you read all these books from Hollywood that I was reading when I took this 4 months break from work, they tell you that you dramatize by fictionalizing, right? You basically take, you analyze the story structure, you understand that here we're missing an extra character who will have this particular relation to the antagonist and to the protagonist, and he will add the necessary conflict or the necessary drama to the story. But in my case, I couldn't just invent characters, I couldn't invent events, and I couldn't invent anything. So I had to work within the confines of nonfiction and of history, but I still had to find ways to dramatize it, to turn it into non-narrative, narrative nonfiction, right? So the narrative part was very important. It's probably the hardest genre to work with, if you think about it, especially when it comes to narrative. I wish I could just have jumped the podcast stage and go directly to writing the screenplay for the film, because there, as with all films, because it will not be a documentary, as in all films, you just say it's inspired by real events. And then you do have the license to dramatize and fictionalize as dramatic needs kind of develop. I couldn't do that, and that also explains why I had to do so many rounds of interviews, why some people I had to interview 7 or 8 times, because it really took a lot of effort to even understand what are the kind of details I need to extract to illustrate a particular part of the story. Right. So it was only in our 7th or 8th interview that Raul Espejo mentioned the dinner that I think he and Stafford had where they were eating, I don't know, or Stafford and Maturana had where they were eating lobsters in the Sheraton Hotel, right? Though they were kind of subsidized by the owner of the Sheraton Hotel, ITT, who had to work within the regulated prices of the Chilean economy. It's a most trivial anecdote, but it adds a certain character to the story, right? But it took literally probably 12 hours of conversation with Raul for me to kind of unearth that anecdote by talking to him, right? And these are the kind of anecdotes that you don't know what you're looking for, right? So you have to get people talking until they give you enough information and enough anecdotes and enough kind of stuff that can paint and characterize a setting or a scene or an event or a character, and then you can work with it to kind of do the work that novelists do. But novelists and screenplay writers, their hands are free, and in my case they aren't free at all. I have to work with real history. So I think I've tried to give you some phenomenological, if you will, experience of what it's like to be somebody writing a podcast of this kind. I'm not sure if I succeeded, but the objective was that, right? I mean, I'm more than happy to talk about any of the storylines or to talk more about Cybersyn or Stafford Beer or anything else, but I thought it was important for you to understand the limitations, the imperatives, and the logics of the genre, because this genre is not an academic paper and it's not a classical monograph of history. We can debate whether it was wise of me to accept this genre and this way of telling this particular story. And in retrospect, maybe it wasn't, because from the beginning, I saw that the story, I didn't think it from the beginning. From the beginning, I thought it's a great story, but I thought that without having read, Aristotle on drama and 60 more books on dramatic storytelling, having read them a year in, I'm not sure the story had all of the dramatic elements that I needed to tell it in the way that I was expected to tell it. So with hindsight, I probably wouldn't have chosen it if my main optimization criteria was doing something of appeal to mainstream audience in 3 or 6 months, right? So I'm still happy that I took it on, and I'm more than happy to have spent 2 years learning so many things about both cybernetics and history of Chile and the life of Stafford Beer, but it's been a labor of love. So I will stop here. It's been almost 30 minutes that I'm talking, and I'll be more than happy to hear your comments and answer any of the questions.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I think, oh, Angela, okay, sorry.
No, it's all right. Well, I just I forgot to introduce John Walker. He's co-chair of Metaphorum, my husband. We weren't sure who of the two of us will be doing this, but anyway, here's John with the first question.
Yes, thank you very much, Evgeny. That's clarified a lot of things for me. The question I've got is about your basic motivation. Why particularly Project Cybersyn, and really what you were hoping would come out of it, what you're hoping to achieve. And you said how you want to engage a lot of people and inspire people in these ideas. But I just wondered if there was something more than that you saw it as something
Sure.
that there would be more stuff coming out of the podcasts in the future.
Sure. I mean, look, there are I kind of, my politics is not news to anybody. I'm very much on the left. I've written for New Left Review and Le Monde Diplomatique, and I kind of come from the progressive side of the spectrum. And on that side of the spectrum, Project Cybersyn enjoys a certain reputation as a forward-looking project from the past, one of the few truly constructive projects of the left, because on the left these days, all the talk is about regulation. We want to regulate big tech, we want to regulate platforms, we want to have rules. There is very little effort to actually build things that are new and to construct infrastructures or platforms that are kind of forward-looking and that try to do more than just put constraints and restraints on big tech and Silicon Valley. So that discussion in the leftist circles, especially among young progressives and young people, is ongoing, and it has been ongoing probably for the last 15 years. I've been, of course, a keen observer of that discussion. I have reviewed Ed and Medina's book in a somewhat controversial essay in The New Yorker in 2014, where I tried to build these connections between Cybersyn or from Cybersyn to Silicon Valley of today. So I've been living in a way in that universe for much longer than the podcast, and that those questions stayed with me. And overall, there is a part to Stafford Beer's intellectual legacy, all the work that has to do with accepting that the world is becoming more complex, and complexity is something that we need to manage as opposed to reduce. I find that truly inspiring and interesting, and something that the left, which by and large still operates in a different paradigm, which does prize rationalization and simplification and a very different approach to complexity, I think it needs to learn from it. So for me, personally and intellectually, there was great value in going systematically through Stafford Beer's work, and I've interviewed many of you about it, and I've read what was there to be read, and I've look through probably most of the documents in the archive, and I have them digitized, and I'll look at them periodically. So there was that intellectual part, but there was also the initial motivation of trying to understand Cybersyn as this great, I don't want to say mythological, but this great kind of exemplary product or project of the left, which many people currently are looking for with inspiration. So when I started the motivation was to understand it a little bit better and to understand how much of what conventional wisdom says about it is true and how much it's not. And I've re-examined I've how should I put it? It's not that I've re-examined, but I've revised my own beliefs about it after these 2 years. So it now looks, I see much more tragedy in the project and in the way in which it was conceived in a very different Chile from the one in which it ended up. But it's a separate, it's a separate story of how my views about it changed, which you didn't ask about.
Okay, thank you very much. Peter.
Okay, well, we're going to now ask Jonathan, I think, he's got a few questions that Jonathan would like to ask.
Yes, we are working together, Jonathan and myself, Marcus, and I'll start with a question now.
And Marcus.
That is, could the Cybersyn project have become the tipping point that would have enabled the Allende administration to succeed?
So, not in the way in which it was originally conceived. I don't think so, because the problems that eventually engulfed and consumed and destroyed the government, or weakened the government, because the destruction of it really happened in the coup, those problems had to do not just with their inability to manage enterprises. And so they had to do with a rather uncertain and ambiguous position on how to empower the base, how to involve citizens and workers in defending the government. It had to do with having a somewhat naive view of the military and its constitutionality. I mean, the historians of Unidad Popular and that period of Chilean history will give you a number of factors where the mismanagement of enterprises, which was the core part of Cybersyn. We can talk about Project Cyberfork, or the way in which the October strike has revised Stafford Beer's views of what the project is about. But in its initial conception, my answer would be no. Or it wouldn't be, it would probably be necessary, but not sufficient condition for doing that. After the October strike, maybe if there was political will to implement some of the revisions that Stafford himself identified of involving and mobilizing the bases, of involving citizens in distribution. I mean, they were already involved in distribution and controls on the supply chain of the state-run sectors of the economy. What wasn't happening is systematic coordination of those activities, right? So you had organizations that would go and check on shopkeepers to make sure that they were not raising prices or were not engaged in hoarding, but there was nothing like cyberstrike software or anything like that that would allow them to, or the telex network that would allow them somehow to coordinate better, right? Then, so that part would have probably helped, but I think the missing part really had to do with the ways in which, and that again, that shows you my kind of radical take on that, the history of the period. It had to do with Allende's reluctance to mobilize the base a year or so earlier, so that they would come to defend him in a more organized manner shortly before the coup, if a coup situation were to develop. That would require some kind of communication system that may have required an integration between radio, TV, newspapers, telexes. You might argue that Project Cyberfork was pointing in that direction, but Project Cyberfork, if you read the documentation and the kind of orientation of it, it was really conceived for a kind of mainstream liberal democratic society where there are debates happening and citizens respond to the debates and the politicians incorporate the views of those citizens. I mean, it was much more conceived for British or American public sphere, as opposed to Chile, where you had, you know, a major newspaper like El Mercurio that became, after the coup, basically a case study in how do you do graphic propaganda in a way, and not just graphic, but also linguistic propaganda, right? With a lot of funding from the CIA and whatnot. So I'm sorry if this is not a very satisfying answer, but I think it had a lot of limits. But it's normal, because it wasn't conceived for preventing the coup or for even stabilizing, you know, parts of the economy that didn't have to do with management of state-run enterprises or state-owned enterprises. Where I think there was potential for cybernetics was in training maybe more of Chilean leaders, leftist leaders, middle layer leaders in cybernetic methodology, because the story that Fernando Flores and Mario Grandi and a few other people who were working in the Ministry of the Economy, then in the Ministry of Finance, and then eventually in La Moneda itself tell is that their understanding of Chilean politics and how to respond to threats was greatly enhanced by the overall exposure to viable system model and to learning more of cybernetics and having a conceptual vocabulary that allowed them to understand the situation and react to it better, right? So in a sense, it was an indirect second order consequence of Project Cybersyn that these ideas, and here, of course, we need to mention that Maturana was there and Hans van Foster was visiting. So it wasn't just Stafford Beer and his kind of import, if you will, of cybernetic vocabulary into the country, but the overall, I think, cybernetic story and the influence of cybernetic ideas on the Chilean government is something that we could have been done more and better and might have helped.
Thank you. I will get back to that. And now my colleague Jonathan.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Marcus, and thanks, everybody. So my question, Evgeny, is really about the politics, and particularly the point where Allende was elected. My reading of the situation was that there was a direct conflict between the agenda he had and had popular support through popular unity. And a key part of that was the nationalization agenda. But obviously on the other side, there was still great technical dependence on international organizations, particularly US organizations. And obviously that nationalization agenda was going to erode support and possibly push it into unsupportive. We now know how unsupportive it was through the Nixon administration, but at that point, do you think in that first year, there are things that Allende could have done differently that would have kept his base support on board, but ran into less problems when he then got into years 2 and 3?
Sure. Well, to speak about Allende here would again be a bit of a misnomer, because you really have to talk about Unidad Popular. So, I mean, something that a lot of people don't understand is that even within his own party, the Socialist Party of Chile, Allende was not a very popular leader. So his own party at times opposed his stance on many issues. And he had to rely on the communists. He actually had much better rapport with the Communist Party of Chile than he had with his own Socialist Party on many issues of the day. And remember, there were 6 parties in that coalition, and there were squabbles inside some of them, like eventually in Mapu, which split into 2. So under those connection, under those sort of in that context, one could, of course, argue that Allende didn't have to press as aggressively as he did, for example, in announcing the nationalization of the copper companies. That's one possibility. But even there, the pressure was coming from the bottom. It was coming very often from the trade unions. It was coming from other parts of the Chilean system. I mean, in the end, the vote in the Senate approving nationalization of the copper companies, I think it was unanimous, but only because the right-wing parties didn't vote. They abstained. But at the end of the day, it was a popular agenda item. Right, so that what antagonized a lot and cost Allende a lot of capital. But if, let's say, Tomic, the Christian Democratic presidential candidate who lost to Allende and Alessandri, had won, he would have probably done the same on nationalization of copper, right? Because he himself was skeptical of the previous strategy of Chileanization, where they just wanted to buy these companies out. So I think that if you read historians like Peter Wynne, who's written probably the best account of the bottom-up dynamic of that revolution, which is a book called The Weavers of the Revolution, which tells you the story of how a textile factory that was not initially on the list, Yarur, that was not initially on the list to be nationalized, is eventually taken up by the workers. And Allende is faced with this decision, whether he approves of that takeover and then gives in to potential other takeovers that are unplanned, or whether he sends the police to suppress the workers and then loses part of the support in the working class. And the historians of Chile to this day, including those sympathetic to Allende, they don't really know what he could have done. I mean, his Minister of the Economy, Vuskovic, threatened to resign if Allende would not approve the Yarur takeover. So in those conditions, we can, of course, speculate about the moves that, we can draw a list of the relative payoffs and the relative costs. And I'm sure that we could come up with maybe 5 measures where he could have been less antagonistic. I can't give you that list off the top of my head without also accounting for what the costs of that antagonism would have been. Right, on many issues, I think he was quite reserved. On ITT, the story that I know the best, the nationalization of the telecom company, he really waited for quite a long time, and he really left enough space for himself to eventually strike a deal with ITT. Where that space disappeared is when somebody started leaking the cables about ITT's complicity with CIA to a journalist in Washington, and that made it politically impossible for Allende to keep negotiating with ITT, so he had to nationalize them. Right, so there were a lot of these factors. It's politics, right? So it's very hard. It might seem that he had more space for maneuver, and in the end he had little, and that's why the historians of Chile still kind of say that, okay, he could have mobilized the bases a bit more and to make sure that the workers would have poured into the streets when the first coup attempt happened in June of '73. And that didn't happen. And when the army and the military saw that the defense of Allende by the working class is much lower than they had expected, they understood that the second coup would succeed, right? So, I mean, that's where I'll leave it there.
Thank you.
Yeah, Marcus.
Yes. Well, one of the big issues, or perhaps the big issue of Stafford with the Cybersyn project was to empower the workers, or perhaps talking larger, improve the situation of the workers. So my question is, what was the contribution of Cybersyn project to the life of Chilean workers?
So we don't have much evidence that the Chilean workers knew about it. So we definitely know that there have been efforts to involve them in modeling of the enterprises. So as you probably know, the idea was to essentially create a model for each enterprise by identifying up to 10 indicators that were informative for what was happening in the production process, right? So the key bottlenecks, the key, I don't know, factors that might cause delays elsewhere in the chain. So having identified those 10 indicators, the idea was to start monitoring them, send the data to a central computer in Santiago, crunch that data and send it back to the participating factories. We don't have much evidence that that data was actually sent back or that anything was done with it once it was sent back. So most of this happened to be not because it wasn't conceived that way. Of course, it was conceived to give autonomy to all these enterprises and tackling their own problems as Stafford's theories dictated. But the problem, I think, was that Corfu was a bit overwhelmed with things going on, and I don't think that there was a systematic effort to send this data back to the companies. Inside the companies that were nationalized and that participated in the project, of course, there were all sorts of changes meant to empower the workers. So the governance of each enterprise was fundamentally transformed. You had new governance bodies with 5 workers and 5 managers and a kind of top administrator appointed by the state. So once that data would have come back, the workers would technically participate, or the representatives of workers would participate in the taking of decisions of how to manage the problem. But beyond that, we didn't really see the workers being involved. In Cybersyn itself, we can talk about citizens being involved in Project Cyberfolk and the way in which the opinions would count. And that was the crux of the critique of Stafford coming from Britain at the time. It was that the workers were not really involved in the design of the system. Like, they were involved in mapping each enterprise, but when it came to designing the operations room and how many chairs to put there and what buttons to have in the chair and what information to fit there, that was a decision taken by Stafford, maybe in consultation with Gibbon Sept to account for ergonomic factors, but by and large, the design of the system was not something open to the workers, right? And I explored that a little bit in the podcast itself, and I don't think I come to either side in this dilemma, because Corfu, that commissioned Stafford Beer, the Chilean government agency, itself was being democratized. So there were workers that were supposed, through trade unions, who were supposed to be integrated into its governing board. So you can, of course, make the argument that it's fine because it was the workers who decided to approve the decision to delegate all of that to Stafford Beer, so it was fine for him to be designing it. Of course, that's not what happened, because when the decision was taken to delegate that everything to him about the design of the system, Corfu was run the old way, with a governing board full of technocrats and Fernando Flores signing off on that decision. Right?
Well, you are talking about the big design issues, but I'm talking about something more simple. I mean, the reception of the data and acting upon this data.
Yeah, but we don't have any evidence of the data ever being received on the factory end. So if you look at Medina's book carefully, I mean, I couldn't find anybody who remembers sending the data to the factories themselves. But in Medina's book, she discusses at some point that including people who are working with Raul, I don't know if he's on this call, didn't have strong memories of actually sending this data back to the companies when it has been analyzed in Santiago. So we could speculate, as I've said at the beginning of my response, who would have received it and who would have acted upon that data on the receiving end, at the enterprise end. And some of those people would include workers because they were promoted to managerial positions. But I couldn't find any evidence that we couldn't find also any workers. And Medina, to her credit, she put ads back in 2005 or 6 when she was writing the dissertation. She put ads in the Chilean newspapers seeking out those workers, and she couldn't find them.
You've got a follow-on question, Marcus?
Yes. How could the Cybersyn project have influenced the political situation more strongly?
Well, I think I've partly answered it in response to the question of whether it would have prevented the coup. I mean, it surely would have helped to keep the Chilean enterprises running. So that part, clearly, you know, you needed to have a system. So the rationale for the project, I think, was completely justified in a Chile way it started. So in the Chile of September 1971, when Flores met Stafford Beer in London, it's a Chile that's full of promise, and they think that they will have 4 or 5 years to implement that program. And in fact, they did need to build a system for managing hundreds of enterprises that were being integrated into the national economy, and they didn't have managers for them. And as I discovered while doing research for the podcast, the United States, through CIA and the US ambassador, were doing their best to encourage managers and technicians to leave. Right, so essentially, they were being deprived of the managerial capacity, and something like Cybersyn made perfect sense as a way to compensate for that. There are limits to what you can do when your environment changes with Cybersyn, and the environment changed radically in the year 2 and 3 of the Allende administration, where you started having terrorist attacks. Patria y Libertad, the right-wing terrorist group, was getting weapons and explosives, some of them from Brazil, some of them possibly from the United States, and they were exploding things. They were blowing up bridges, and in those conditions, I mean, sure, it's better to have a system that allows you to predict problems that are emerging, but it's not the usual business context for which Cybersyn was designed, right? And you can't using statistics predict where the next explosion is going to blow up your bridge, or pierce nails thrown on the road will pierce the wheels of the truck. So in a sense, I think what it was missing is the connection to the rest of the government. So, and the ability and the desire of the rest of the government to use the cybernetic machinery proactively, not just for crisis management, but also for running the country, right? So the way to make it more useful would be to build bridges between Cybersyn and, let's say, the Ministry of the Economy or the Ministry of Finance or the political parties or the trade unions. And it's possible that, as Stafford Beer was in Las Cruces shortly before he left and the coup happened, he wanted to introduce all these other actors into his model. And it's possible that a revised Cybersyn that would have emerged from it would have integrated more actors. The problem is that Corfu itself, by that time, wasn't particularly thrilled about it, right? And Fernando Flores was busy doing other things, and they just didn't have the political capital to take on, in my opinion. Again, I'm more than happy to debate here, but in my opinion, they didn't have the political capital to take on these more ambitious tasks and these more ambitious missions with the expanded remit. Because Raul, I don't know if he's on the call or not, just didn't have enough political capital for it. And Fernando Flores was doing something else. And Stafford Beer was getting more and more radicalized in his rhetoric and in his essays, and he was not an easy person to interact with the Chilean bureaucracy, for the kind of more established conventional Chilean bureaucrats. And a combination of those factors, I think, would have made it difficult for the project to take on a bigger role, even if they did build those bridges.
I think Jonathan has a question that's sort of related to this to follow on. Jonathan.
I've got a kind of two-part question, Evgeny, which very much relates to what we've just been talking about over the last few minutes. Because when I've read accounts of the different stages of Cybersyn, particularly in that period, late 72 and into 73, the dilemmas become quite distinct in terms of, yeah, you've got a kind of leadership vacuum for a number of understandable reasons. But you've got dilemma one, which is, do you keep with the political aspect of Cybersyn, which, like you said, Beer was exhorting the team to do, that you then run into difficulties of adoption in certain areas because of the politics, or do you make it a more technical, less political endeavor, which means you can sell it across a larger part of the political spectrum? So the first question is, do you think there was a way to do both of that, or do you think inherently in that situation, late 72, 73, the only real option was to go the kind of the less political, more technical route with the project?
I mean, look, I think that ultimately the technical route would have been the safest, but there were also diminishing returns to, as I've tried to point out in my previous answer, to the kind of predictions that the system was able to offer. So if you read a very interesting account that Schwember published, one of the kind of people involved in the project, published in 77 or 78, he basically tells you that in one of the ministries, I think in the Ministry of the Economy, they did use a viable system model to map out the problems, and they built a basic operations room. And it was just showing them things that they could phenomenologically like already smell in the air, because the atmosphere of crisis was already profound and ubiquitous. And it's at that point that the system was just registering their own impotence in a way, right? That they were already aware of implicitly in some sense or another. I mean, of course, but that's also because the nature of the problems that they were experiencing was so heterogeneous and so unlike the typical business industrial context in which Stafford initially developed these insights, right? It was Britain of 1950s and 1960s, and not Chile torn apart by terrorist attacks and the CIA and ITT and all these other extra factors. Going through a more political route, of course, would have been a risky bet, and it all depends on what kind of alliances they would have nurtured. Right? The reason I think why Cybersyn received the support that it did receive inside the Chilean government was because they aligned with a particular faction inside MAPU, which was a political party, a small political party that was part of the Unidad Popular coalition, and that faction, in a way, itself was being decentralized and split as the debates got more and more intense. Right, so of course Fernando Flores remained with the moderates, but for example Gariton, who was one of the people who Stafford Beer met on his first trip and explained Cybersyn, and Gariton kind of blessed that as Undersecretary of the Economy, Gariton ended up running the most radical faction of MAPU, which split and got a slightly different name. So under those conditions, it's hard for me to imagine what would a more political Cybersyn look like without understanding what its political backing was like. If we're talking just about Fernando Flores, then it was a very weak backing, because Fernando had a lot of capital, but he was involved in so many other things, and he was negotiating with the military, and he was doing a lot of things for Allende. And as I think the consensus now holds, he was kind of missing in action from the project from relatively early stages. And I try to understand who Stafford's other interlocutors were at the time. And I heard people mentioning that he was meeting with the trade unions, with CUT, he was meeting with the Socialist Party. I couldn't find more, right? I did find a story about somebody from the Socialist Party spinning and weaving intrigues to try to take the Cybersyn from Fernando Flores. I mean, there were speculations and people insinuating that when I talked to them. I don't know to what extent Stafford was kind of in between these efforts, but at the end of the day, without knowing who his new allies would have been in this political game, it's very hard for me to give you an answer. And the only hints that Stafford gives is in the second edition of Brain of the Firm, where he mentions this mysterious trips to Las Cruces in the middle of the night, where he would meet with politicians. So they would take him in the middle of the night to Santiago, and he would meet with different political party leaders or trade union leaders, but we don't know who they are and we don't know where they come from. So it's hard to kind of give an empirical answer as to the validity and viability of this political project that may have been different from the initial MAPU backing that he enjoyed.
So, thank you. I understand Raul is actually here. And Raul, if you wanted to jump in, you need to unmute your mic and put your video on. I know that, Jonathan, I think you've got one other question. Maybe if you'd like to ask that, and then Raul could perhaps jump in after this last question you've got.
So again,
thank you, Peter. In fact, I prefer to hear as much as possible, Eugene,
Okay.
and I will have plenty of time to give my views when on Friday I say a few words.
Okay.
So, for the time being, unless I hear something that is clearly wrong and clearly misleading, I will not try to influence what Eugene is saying.
Okay, very good. I just wanted to acknowledge your presence as Evgeny had brought your name up about 2 or 3 times here already. So thank you very much, Jonathan.
Thanks, Ralph. So again,
could I say, Peter, that I have difficulties in hearing Jonathan?
Yes, Jonathan, if you can. Yes, I did think you're a bit
okay.
faint, so maybe get closer to the microphone or just raise your voice a little louder.
I will lean forward and project.
Thank you.
So my last question, Evgeny. Again, I think we've touched on some of this in the previous answers, so don't feel obliged to answer in full if you feel we've covered it. But the other dilemma I was sensing in that period, late 72 into 73, was where do you focus the resources in Cybersyn? Do you make the focus if you like, information for top-level management? So the whole political context in this context, or do you start to focus effort as Veer was encouraging for more work interacting directly on the shop floor, so to enable, if you like, the cybernetic knowledge into a kind of factory level bottom-up type of approach?
Mm-hmm.
And the question really is, do you think it was realistic to pursue those 2 possibilities, or was it very much a choice? You either go for one or the other. There just wasn't the headroom and the resources to do both.
Sure. So my understanding, based again reading mostly on the telexes and the correspondence and some of the memos that Stafford wrote to the team, that worker-led bottom-up element had to do mostly with him hearing news that the workers in some cases did not understand the project, or they had difficulty relating to it, and they were not. So his initial thought, and that is, I think, even explicitly in this very language, it's mentioned somewhere, his initial thought that, the moment they launched the operations room and they build a quantified flow chart, the workers would be ecstatic about it and they would want to use those tools. And I think a few months in, when people started going to the factories in order to model them and talk to the workers, there was not that great enthusiasm that Stafford was expecting. And as part of that, he developed all sorts of strategies that he started advocating in the memos as to how he can make this more exciting to the workers. Right? At the moment you explain to them the quantified flow chart and that it's really a tool of management that will allow them to manage the enterprises better, because now they're supposed to be managers, they're not just workers, they will get it. Right? And it was the same very much about the operations room and about the whole package, right? So he really thought that it was about explaining the tools to the workers to get their buy-in, so that they would then be contributing voluntarily to map out the quantified flowcharts and to help model the factories, right? So I'm not sure if there was more to it than that in terms of trying to mobilize the workers, right? And there was clearly, I think, a discussion about needing to present this project to the upper levels, to both Corfo, because At some point, Vuskovic, who was the minister of the economy, ends up as the executive vice president in Corfu, and it's a new leadership. And Fernando, of course, goes away and is replaced by General Sergio Poblete. And he has his own ideas, but he's an old general of the Air Force and not necessarily, disciple of Stafford Beer. So there are clearly concerns about needing to work also with the upper echelons and to explain the project to them and to sell it to them. And I think this was an interesting moment in the whole telex exchange between Raul and Stafford Beer. It's the need to finally get this operations room inside Corfu, right? And because it would have been a symbolic move, because the room remained standing in that space that they found in November of 1972 in the former Reader's Digest building, and it was a presentation, a demonstration space. Mostly, it wasn't integrated into the daily routine of Corfu, and there is a lot of discussion in the telexes and the archives throughout 1973 about whether Corfu will finally accept that room and install it on its premises. And at some point, Raul communicates this news to Stafford, and Stafford is ecstatic to hear that they have finally voted to accept it in the main building. And of course, they don't have the time to move it before the coup, so it ends up being where it was.
Thank you. I mean, in this sort of exploration of cybernetics, which you've now been on for years in such depth, I've got a question here from Ray Eisen, who's joined us. He's a president of the International Federation for Systems Research currently, and a former president of the International Society for System Sciences. And he asks, what, if any, dissonances or coherences between the ideas of Stafford Beer, Maturana, and von Forster with respect to Chile have your research revealed?
It's hard for me to answer that, because I don't know if Heinz von Foster had a lot of big ideas about Chile, but I also haven't specifically looked at them. I know that he was there. I interviewed, for example, Ken Wilson, one of the students in the class that he ran there in June of 1973. I know that he was very active on getting political prisoners out and helping Fernando Flores while Fernando Flores was on Dawson Island. I know all of that. I don't know if that amounted to some general idea about Allende administration and where Allende went wrong, and the general ideas about Chile. I don't know. I just haven't seen them, and I've done some work in Van Foster's archives on other matters. I just haven't come upon that strand of literature. Maturana, I think, again, some of you knew him personally, and you probably know that he had, and I didn't know him personally, so I can only speak from what I heard from others and what I've read. I mean, he clearly was somewhat, clearly, okay, I wouldn't say this word, but he seemed to have been traumatized by the events of the coup, as anybody would have, and he stayed in Chile, as you know, and I don't know, again, because I haven't really explored the Maturana side of the story as closely as maybe I should have. I don't know what where he had communicated those ideas about Chile and about politics. From what I know, he had normally been very reserved to speak on political matters. It's possible, of course, that he did express those opinions somewhere in public. I just didn't. I didn't find them.
There's another avenue for you to pursue in the follow-on work. It sounds like you might be doing that. Let's move to another perspective now, if I might, and that is to hand over to Elena Leonard, who is a former president of ISSS. She's the current president of Metaphorum, but more importantly, she was Stafford's partner for many, many years. And I know that she's got a number of questions and thoughts that she would like to share. Elena, if you're ready to turn your mic on.
I'm ready.
Very good.
I think my overall impression is that I would never have recognized Stafford from the depictions that came out in the interview and in the podcast. He was very much not an upper class person. I never knew him to order champagne. I I never knew him to kind of identify with any of the so-called aristocratic British ways of doing things. He came from a modest middle-class background. He was a scholarship student in a day school, and he earned his money by working, not by inherited wealth. So I don't understand what the purpose was of depicting Stafford as an aristocrat rather than a middle-class fellow who was good at innovation and who made his way into the executive ranks in Britain, basically by talent and hard work.
Sure. So I'm happy to answer that. I don't think I ever presented him as an aristocrat. So I said upper class, which all that means is that at the time of his call to go to Chile, he was probably lying in the upper 5-10% of the British income, distribution. Everything I've heard about his lifestyle back then, and about the Firkins house, and about the Rolls Royce, and about we even have his accounts and how much money he was making, how much money he was spending. That I think would clearly justify putting him, if not in upper middle class, then in upper class. I never implied that, even though there are parts of the family, and I interviewed Vanilla Beer's cousin, who has the whole family tree going back to the town of Stafford in 12th century, and it involves decapitation of some of Stafford's relatives in the Tower of London. I mean, there is that part of the story, which I didn't go to, but I didn't mean to imply anything at all about the aristocratic end of the story. So I think that part I wouldn't necessarily accept as criticism. I mean, I do understand that your interaction with him was from the early 80s onwards, which to some extent maybe strengthens the argument that he did change enormously after Chile. But everybody I interviewed, not everybody, but a lot of the people I interviewed who knew him both at United Steel and Sigma did point out, if not champagne, then clearly, I don't know whether drinking champagne classifies somebody as an aristocracy or upper class in Britain, but there was clearly a lot of consumption of sherry and whiskey and whatnot. So, and the visits to fancy tea houses in London, and having a chauffeur, and spending time in a pool with Robert Maxwell. I mean, if somebody spends time in a pool with Robert Maxwell circa 1972, to me, he would classify as probably as an upper class part of British elite. We can quibble about that, but there was no intent on my behalf to say that his wealth was inherited or somehow it wasn't meritocratic. So it's just a description of where Stafford Beer stood in the British hierarchy circa 1971, which is when I introduced him into the story, without getting into his father working for probably the most important shipping insurance company that appears in the Dickens novel, or mentioning his brother.
Well, I would quibble somewhat with that, because the British class system certainly does not define as upper class somebody who makes their way into a high salaried position. I should also mention that his chauffeur was not provided by himself. This was something that was provided by the company. When he went independent as an independent consultant after international publishing, and that's probably where he met Robert Maxwell, is that Maxwell published a paper that was a rival paper to the one published by international publishing. And the fact that they were in the pool together, I'm not sure how many other interactions they ever had. Other than
I found quite a few in his oral interviews where he does say that Maxwell was the only person who got Stafford's computer vision. But sorry, I interrupted.
Well, but again, I think even talking about the Rolls Royce, as an independent consultant, he figured he needed a prestige car, so he bought a used Rolls Royce, thinking that that was the cheapest, most reliable and car to have that met the prestige criteria. but also that it met the criteria of something that would hold its value. And when he sold it, he got as much for it as he paid. And so that, that kind of underscores that he was practical in many ways. And he wasn't somebody who just, regarded that stuff as his birthright.
Sure. I mean, I accept this critique in a sense that his wealth wasn't inherited. I think that there is no doubt about that. To what extent the family connections helped, I don't know. The story that Vanilla would tell you and told me several times, and I think there is a record of Stafford even stating that in one of the interviews, for example, of his father calling on one of his old chaps to get Stafford into UCL as a young talented man. I mean, I don't know to how many people from the British middle class that happens, right? So, I mean, think here we really need to understand. I mean, I don't really want to have a big discussion of the British class system, but I think there are certain parts of the Beer family, particularly related to his father, and to some extent maybe also to his mother, that did shape his trajectory in ways that we do not fully understand, and certainly shape the trajectory of his brother. To what extent something like Whitgift School, to which he went, would classify as a place for poor people or for middle class people or for upper class people, I don't know. But the intent of me setting the story up this way was to dramatize the arc of change that happened with Stafford Beer. It wasn't to make a comment on the British class system. It was really to point out to the basic fact that here is somebody who was probably in the top 5 executive pool of IPC, then the largest publishing company in the world, making a transition that is quite radical. And I think that is still valid, regardless of whether we classify him as upper middle class or upper class or just a meritocratic success story. I think the basic point is that he was rich and had connections and could have had a very different career in Britain if he wanted to. And he decided not to, right? Which you know better than me. So in that sense, I understand that possibly some people, especially in Britain, might read more into what I said than I intended, and I'm sorry about that.
Well, another thing that I wondered about was that why there were mentions of some things that didn't work, like the Alan Waters connection never got past Stafford and a few others being part of a one-page brochure. And that the other things that he had done were not ever mentioned. The impression that one gets from the podcast is that he pretty much, had an ineffectual, quiet time after Chile, when the reverse was true. I went with him to Uruguay. That was a 3-year project. I went with him to Venezuela. I went with him to Colombia. He went to South Africa and India on assignments. There was a big project between Canada and Wales where we had brought a bunch of people over from Canada to Wales. He did a number of specific projects for the Canadian government, many through his long-term connection with Ernst & Winnie.
Sure.
He was very busy. He wrote 6.5 books after Chile, count the half being the second edition of The Brain of the Firm. And it was not an ineffectual, quiet time when all he did was meditate and write poetry.
Sure. So I don't think that the Alan, the connection, the Alan Walters connection is as brief as a brochure. I mean, the company Intercouncil, as I discovered in talking to Chilean bureaucrats, I mean, it did try to market its services to them, and there were several meetings held, and other partners involved in Intercouncil exchange and correspondence with Chilean bureaucrats over a pretty long period of that government. So the fact that there is a brochure in the archive is reflective of the fact that there is a brochure in the archive. It's not necessarily reflective of how active they were. And there are actually there is correspondence related to their council in other folders in the archive, which I have discovered. So, and there is Stafford reflecting upon his connection and knowledge of Walters in subsequent oral interviews. So it's not as if it was a one-time contact and he forgot that Walters existed. I don't think I draw much from that connection other than to show that symbolically and metaphorically, it's just interesting. And that ultimately what dramatic storytelling is. I mean, you try to build almost at a kind of level of collective unconscious connections and to bring out connections. And here is a former partner of Stafford Beer who was marginally involved in some of Intercouncil's pitching to the Chilean government, becoming an advisor to Pinochet and an advisor to Thatcher and an interlocutor of Pinochet, and becoming the bridge between Chile and Britain, which was Stafford's kind of preferred role, which he would have loved to have if Allende had stayed in government. So for me, metaphorically, it's a way to dramatize the lens to which Stafford had traveled by alienating himself from the people like Alan Walters, because normally it would have been more traditional to expect people like Stafford Beer on that side of the barricades and not where he ended up advising Allende. As for the rest of his activities after Chile, I do mention them partly in the very last episode in the postscript that you hear in the last 10 minutes. I do mention that he did more work in Latin America. I did mention that he published a couple of more books. I did mention that his ideas were taken up by consulting companies. I mentioned all of that. I compress it. Again, here, my decisions are driven more by the need to tell the story in a dramatic and engaging manner, as opposed to tell the full story of Stafford Beer's biography. Way at the film, the way the story would develop is that it will probably stop in 1973 with the coup, and then you will have a flash on screen with 3 paragraphs of text telling you what has happened. This is how films work, right? And the way it works like this is not because you think that it's not important what happens after 1973, but because you just can't sustain narrative pressure and narrative drive for 3, 5, 6, 7 more hours. So I realistically had only two episodes to tell the story what happens after 1973, and I had to jump through a lot of hoops by introducing the story of Operation Condor and many others to make sure that it doesn't just drift into a very long-winded postscript. Like, this is what happened to the characters 20 years later. I couldn't do it. Like, I could do it maybe in a bonus episode, and maybe I should have done a bonus episode, but I was just under-resourced and understaffed to do that. So I had to realistically choose what I want to discuss in these 2 episodes, and of course, we can again quibble. I decided to highlight the florist life and afterlife in Silicon Valley, and occasionally in a very critical light. I decided to highlight the transformations that Chicago Boys brought to Chile. I decided to highlight a lot of things. As a result of those decisions, there is less attention to Stafford Beer's own transformation. I do understand that maybe cramming this important projects that he's done in the end is a bit tricky, because some people might not reach the very last 10 minutes. But that would have been the case if I did a film and put a slide with what happened, right? But I do know about those projects. I interviewed the person involved in Ganon in the Uruguay project. I spent 3 hours talking to him. I interviewed a lot of people who were involved with Stafford later, in Mexico and elsewhere. So it's not that that story part was unknown to me, just that my hands were tied to some extent by the need to tell the story dramatically.
Well, I can understand the desire to tell a dramatic story, but it also felt a little bit like, a spin doctor rather than a historian. And I'm concerned that some of the other initiatives that I'm aware of people who wanted to write about Cybersyn and Stafford and the cybernetics community might feel that, having spoken to you and not seen what they told you reflected in the podcast, but cherry-picked, I'm afraid that people will be reluctant to speak with further interviewers.
Well, I mean, that's always a danger and a risk in storytelling, but all storytelling is cherry picking, right? It's not, I come from a hermeneutic tradition in history where every story is told from a certain vantage point and by highlighting and hiding certain elements. Clearly, as I hoped I made clear, was the Chile the main focus of the story. Even stretching it beyond 1973 was a challenge, because everybody was, my scriptwriter told the guy who's actually worked with me on screenwriting, who, tried to offer advice, but it was very hard because he never worked with the documentary nature of the story. He told me from day one, you should end the story in 1973, because this is the dramatic moment. Just don't even bother thinking about anything else, because that's when the story ends. I could have avoided a lot of the problems you're mentioning now by following his advice. I decided against it. I decided against it because I thought it was important to show both the transformation in Stafford Beer, the character. I could have, of course, also shown the transformation in Stafford Beer, the thinker. I just don't think that realistically within this format it would have worked. I understand that, of course, people who had worked with Stafford in later chapters of his life may feel that I neglected somehow that element, but it wasn't by design, right? I honestly spent a lot of hours of my time preparing for interviews with them and interviewing them and going through the literature and really trying to understand how to tell that story. But at the end of the day, I had to tie it all up somehow, and I tied it up the way I did. But that's the risk of storytelling. There are a lot of people from Sigma. I've interviewed everybody who's still alive who worked with Stafford Beer in Sigma. I can understand that they are also quite unhappy, because in the end, there is just one line about Sigma in the whole podcast. But you could argue that, of course, I should have been more responsible and should have planned it better and should have had a much better layout of the land before I even got into the interviews. I accept that critique partly, but I discovered so much more in the process of doing this that it would have been impossible to do otherwise.
Well, I guess that, that makes sense, but I do think that it's unfortunate that you portrayed his changes as essentially almost a 180, rather than noting that probably a number of people told you that his sympathies had been with the left since he was a teenager in the British Army.
They told me I couldn't find evidence of that in none of the documents and oral histories and the documents. It's not there.
Well, he certainly spoke about it to me.
Yeah, sure, but it was in 1980, right? I haven't heard him talking about the 1962. Like, had that been the case, of course, I would have cited it.
Well, he certainly talked to me about things like he had an old coat that he would wear so he could slip into the Labor Party presentations and meetings when he worked for United Steel, when he wouldn't be recognized, because, being recognized as having sympathies on the left would have not been very good for his career. There were a number of incidents like that he certainly spoke to me about, but I think he lost progressively more respect for the establishment, and it was pretty much gone by the time of the coup. But it certainly wasn't a 180. One final thing I would mention is that we had a conversation with Jack Ford, who was somebody who was involved in the early years of the American Society for Cybernetics, and we actually spoke with him over lunch at a Cybernetics Society conference, and he told us that there was an element, including himself, in the CIA that wanted the CIA to keep hands off Chile, because they wanted to see how that experiment would work out. And of course, they were overruled by Kissinger and his crew. But that the whole idea about how cybernetics could be used to improve everyone's life, workers as well as management, seems to be something that is still very relevant.
Sure. No, you mentioned that to me when I interviewed you. Again, I followed up on that. I found nothing in the CIA archives even vaguely suggesting that the CIA considered giving more breathing space for Allende, not just cybernetic, but on everything else. That's why I didn't use it, right? So, I mean, you have to understand that in my case, I have to also be prepared to the fact that fellow historians would attack me and that they would look at the material that I'm citing without necessarily, so I mean, sure, Stafford Beer, the story that he gives after Chile is that he's been a man of the left all his life. The materials that we have. And I understand that maybe he needed to hide to preserve his integrity and his career. I understand all of that. But I don't think that I was implying that he was a man of the right and he became a man of the left. I think so this would be your 180 transformation. I think what I was implying is that he was by and large a management theorist, maybe with some sympathies for the left. I actually cite in the podcast the experience of United Steel, where he would work with the workers to monitor what they do and then organize a bonfire of the tapes, when he actually says it in his own voice. So I do hint at his leftist sympathies, but I present him by and large as a management theorist. And it's after the trip to Chile where he awakens and starts talking about dependency and the injustice of IMF and the CIA. I wouldn't say it's a transformation from right wing to left wing. It's a transformation from a manager to a political thinker and activist.
Well, he certainly didn't see any reason to pull any punches after Chile in terms of what he thought was going wrong. And he cited the Frank Church senatorial hearings in terms of the bad behavior of the CIA. And I understand there's more papers that have just been released in the past month or two. Sure. But at any rate, I will pass on and just hope that with your further work, you at least do not depict Stafford as somebody who was upper class, because that really wasn't his identity.
Thank you, Elena, and thank you, Evgeny, for the conversation there. It's quite fascinating to listen to this unfolding mini drama of this 2 hours and to reflect on that. And I've got a question here from Catherine Farrell, who has been listening and talks about this drama motif of this narrative and your tension, and which I've heard now from you, talk about the tension between being a classical historian to a storyteller, to the need to produce a product that has a market. And she goes on to say, well, I just added that in, but she goes on to say, in politics being about drama. And she wants to ask you, do you think Cybersyn could help us in the work of democratizing the digital twin idea of monitoring and management of the Anthropocene in the AI context of today? And are you concerned about the ways in which the choice to make this work a commercial enterprise has unjustly characterized Beer as a mad scientist on the basis fed into a dismissal of that project? That's from Catherine Farrell.
Sure. I mean, look, I've interviewed a broad range of people. I've seen also some archival documents. I've seen letters between the British civil servants. I've seen them cited in a different, like, historian's book. I mean, look, there is no running around the fact that Stafford Beer had a certain reputation before Chile, and that reputation wasn't always that of well, let's just say there was some eccentricity to his career even before Chile. And the way people I've interviewed that I didn't put into the podcast, who worked with him or after his arrival, who were at United Steel after his arrival. And, you know, we're talking before Sigma, we're talking before Chile. And they did perceive him as a rather eccentric, mad scientist type of character. You know, and his work with Gordon Pask on biological computing and other things did not necessarily dissuade them or disabuse them of that notion. So I don't think that the commercial nature of this enterprise, and so far, you know, it's commercial in theory only, because so far it's only a money-losing venture, but the commercial nature of this enterprise, I don't think somehow made me focus on those parts of the story. It was a recurring theme, talking to quite a lot of people. So sure, if I were writing solely, I think that even in an intellectual biography, I would have needed to account for that. You know, if it's one person who tells you something odd about someone else, you think maybe they have a grudge to bear and you dismiss it, or you try to ask more people the same question. And in my case, there was a recurring theme among the people that knew him that it surfaced, and it surfaced even before the transformation that occurred in the cottage in Wales. With regards to the applicability of Cybersyn to questions related to Anthropocene and climate management, I think that there is a lot of work to be done on computer models and Latin American computer models in general that we are only beginning to do right now. And this is why we need, I think, comparative studies of the uptake. Some of that work, like David Maulen is now doing, for example, a Chilean scholar. But we need a comparative understanding of the uptake of computer models in Latin America in that period to model both the economy and the planet, right? And that's why one part of the podcast that I could never really tell, and even though I interviewed probably 10 or 15 people on it, and I've read a lot of books, has to do with the experiments from Bariloche Foundation in Argentina that were happening more or less in the early 70s around the same time, in dialogue with Oscar Warszawski that had a connection to Carlos Sena, who appears in the podcast. They were actually criticizing the limits to growth and the MIT approach to economic modeling and to modeling of the planet from the perspective of the global south, right? And articulating their own counter position. Cybersyn as such would enter into it only through the Chaco part, the model of the Chilean economy. I'm sure that people working on VSM will tell you, justly so, that there are all sorts of ways in which VSM itself can help us, not just the planning, not the planning, but the kind of foresight function. Sorry for I know I'm stepping into kind of worms by ascribing functions to different levels, but not the kind of system for modeling of the economy and modeling of the world out there and modeling of the future, but the entire kind of 5-level model might be of help. But I do think that building a more comparative look between and into other types of modeling happening in Latin America at the time and situating Cybersyn within them would be a very good, fruitful step in that direction. And
I can see that. I can see that this would be actually another series in and of itself in terms of the contemporary implications. And I think that I would be very interested in pursuing that with you. But in the interest of moving along, prior to this session, a number of the organizations represented here asked their members to submit questions, and I think we have a synopsis of them here that we'd just like to move through. So if we can move to that part of this session, and I think the first question, I think Angela, you have a question that's come from the collective.
Yes, Evgeny, my question is, I think that many people, the intentions are very divided between some people that recognize the value of the documentary and the work that you have done. Other people like myself and Elena and Vanilla and John and people who knew very closely Stafford, quite upset by the way that you characterized Stafford, because I think that you missed an opportunity. Stafford was a fascinating character, and you missed an opportunity by ridiculizing the way that you did. You really missed the point about the character of Stafford. And you also missed the point about the value of cybernetics. We're going to talk more about a little bit later, but given the fact that neither Stafford's painting in the podcast or the scientific understanding of the Cybersyn or the value that it has in terms of governance and the contributions of the Cybersyn project to operational research and management sciences are clear at all in your podcast, would you say that the result of the podcast is an accurate historical documentary, or just an entertaining story very loosely based on fact? Because if it's the second one, your intention to dramatize was always prevailing in the choice of interviewees, in the choice of opinions. I mean, you confess in the interview you did in This Machine Kills that you basically had the intention of finding a character that was very attractive from a performative and dramatic point of view. And once you found this idea of Stafford and this millionaire, playing cybernetic games with the poor Chileans that didn't understand and whatever, all this ridiculization you do, after you do that, you seem to find bits in the interviews that confirm that characterization, and then you manage this really, really performative, attractive podcast, which is really interesting. But could you accept that this is just an entertaining story loosely based on facts?
Of course, I will not accept that. And if you think it's loosely based on facts, I invite you to challenge any of the facts I'm citing on the website. But to answer your question, I never presented it as a documentary. These are the words that you're putting in my mouth right now. In this presentation at the beginning, I presented it as narrative nonfiction, which is a genre, very established genre, pioneered actually in Latin America by a guy called, what's his name? Rodolfo Walsh, an Argentinian writer who wrote a book called Operation Massacre in 1956, where the intention is to use real historical events to tell not just stories, but to illustrate themes. And that themes could be, the fall of Peronism, it could be the height of the Cold War, it could be the problems within the military and the civil service or the civil government. There can be all sorts of themes that you can illustrate in that manner. This is a pretty established genre. The genre is now penetrated the world of podcasting, and I see no reason why I should be judged by the standard of the genre or the medium, which in this case is a documentary, that I deliberately did not pursue. Because were it a documentary, the story would have been told very differently. I would have started by saying, there's this guy, Stafford, he was born in this year, he died in this year, he comes from this family, here are his children. There was a coup in Chile in 1973. As a result, Pinochet came to power. I would have given all these details in episode 1. And from there, I would then use every episode to tell a particular facet of the story. It could be a story about the design of the chairs. It could be a story about the software used by Cybersyn to run the management of Chilean factories. It could be an episode dedicated to something. That's not a format that I chose for reasons that I can explain, and I tried to explain in the beginning of the presentation. That you guys have a fascination with cybernetics. I have no doubt about that. You have a society dedicated to it. I don't think that that's the only angle to understanding Allende's government engagement with tech. I made it very clear in the podcast that there was an agenda of kind of building and restoring the technological sovereignty of Chile that Allende pursued in his fight against ITT, in the efforts of Allende and his Minister of Foreign Affairs, Orlando Letelier, to set up a whole fund akin to the International Monetary Fund to fund and develop technologies differently. There were many other efforts in that vein, informed by CEPAL, post-structural economics, dependency theory, which I unearthed, which I show connections that people were reading dependency theory at the time. Is it an entertaining story to be talking about dependency theory in 2023? I don't think so. Is it something that was in the air at the time and people, including Fernando Flores, were reading it? Yes. Is it something that I, as a thinker, think is something that we should be reading to confront the challenges of today, including the challenges of Silicon Valley? Yes. That's why I decided to downplay the discussion of viable system model or cybernetics and focus on things that actually I, as an intellectual, as an author, think are relevant to today's challenges. Now, we can, of course, quibble about that. You can try to convince me that without cybernetics, we're not going to solve the problems of the world. I'm happy to have the discussion, but to basically take a project which very consistently pursues themes, you can see that. Fight against multinationals, double-sided nature of technology, with the same infrastructure used in Operation Condor, the critiques of expertise by bottom-up initiatives and radical far-left movements, all of these themes are there. If you guys can see them, I'm sorry, they're well reflected in the media reviews that come out. Critics who have read it carefully have noticed them. So I don't know what else I can tell you. If you want to frame it so antagonistically that somehow I've taken all of this and I've presented a podcast without themes, without ideas, without no relevance for today's world, then why do all the reviews of the podcast appear not on the pages of book reviews or film reviews, but on the actual cultural or political pages, which relate that story to today and do that without mentioning cybernetics? That should be an indicator that there are possibly bridges between that story of Allende and his government and today's world that have been missed by the cybernetics community as it confronted that story for the past 2 decades.
I think you've raised this is the really interesting debate to have, and the role of as you say, the genre and the presentation of history, which of course we could spend the next day talking about. So thank you.
Peter, let me just mention.
Okay.
I think that clearly this is a point I want to offer in my conversation this Friday. So
Okay.
I think there is no need to be antagonistic in this. What is necessary is to understand the boundaries of the system that we were designing in Chile. And the result of that, and as I did mention to Eugene personally, is something that I find is useful for us, not only as the cybernetic community, but as scientists, to explain and understand, so that we offer positive contributions to the development of what was the work in Chile in 1970-73 to the world in which we operate today.
Okay. Yes, so do sign up for Raul's.
Yes, I just want to say, Peter, and I'll pass the word to the next panelist, that I agree with Raul, and apologies, Evgeny, if I was too passionate. I had enormous respect for your podcast. I think that you've done a very good work. I just wanted to highlight that for some of us cyberneticians, we feel upset by the way that you downplayed Stafford's character and cybernetics. But that was my point, and we will be able to discuss that more later. Okay, but nothing against you. I think that your podcast is very, very well done and very well documented. So please don't apologize if I did say things in an offensive way. That wasn't not my intention. Okay.
Can I just add one sentence, and then I think there are others that wanted to contribute. I mean, look, within the genre, this not being a documentary, you can't just unload, like I'm not carrying a carriage like a horse, which I can then unload and drop on the audience. Like you can do that in a documentary. That's why most people don't follow documentaries, because they're very intense and they make it very hard to follow the story in a kind of gripping, dramatic manner. There is nothing wrong with drama, and there is nothing wrong with narrative. Narrative can be good, but it has to be done properly. So when you tell me that, oh, there were all these other sides of Stafford Beer that we could have shown, to show it in my genre, in narrative nonfiction, I need to do what's called characterization. You do characterization through action. You don't just say Stafford Beer was a great guy. Like, you have to show stories, you have to show settings, you have to show examples where he had exhibited those qualities as a character, right? So clearly, my ability to do that in the time after Chile is very limited, because nothing in the story revolves around that. So there is very little interaction that he has with the rest of the crew. Like, he has interaction with Fernando Flores in Toronto, I mentioned it. But since there are other parts of the story and Stafford Beer does not directly interact with them, my ability to do what's known as characterization is limited. Right. So, and I can't just be doing proclamations. That's why, like, it's not a documentary, because in a documentary, you can, in fact, allow characters to say, oh, Stafford Beer was X, Y, and Z. Like in my case, I actually have to show it. I have to manifest it. I have to insert him into situations, which means that I have to choose. Do I want to have the story of Michael C. Jackson telling the anecdote of Stafford Beer delivering a lecture at Oxford at that after dinner party, which does characterize certain parts of Stafford's personality? Or do I want to tell a different story? Like, and my space is limited, and you can argue, okay, well, the story of Michael C. Jackson is not as illustrative as a story that I had interacting with Stafford Beer, and I accept that. But ultimately, it's not that there is an infinity of stories and characterizations that I can tell. There are other constraints that shape which parts I can highlight and which I can't, which have to do with chronology, which have to do at what part of the story it appears, which has to do how it interacts with other characters. It's driven by factors which remain invisible to most of you, but they're there.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating challenge that you had, and your explanations have, I think, been very helpful here over the last hour and 45 minutes. Now, we did agree originally to go for 2 hours, and we've got a few other questions to go through. Evgeny, are you free to carry on?
I'm okay.
Okay, wonderful. Well, let me do that then, and maybe we'll go for another 10 or 15 minutes over the top of the hour. I think that, John, you had a couple of questions you wanted to ask next.
Yeah,
John.
well, I think I'll limit it to one given the time.
Right.
Evgeny, I was very fascinated by your work on Cybersyn and Operation Condor, and I must admit I found it the connection between the two quite tenuous, and there was a kind of an underlying unspoken implication that Cybersyn led to Condor, which of course Condor was this terrible intergovernment information system to get rid of left-wing and union leaders, and I wondered how you made that connection and how valid you think it is, because like I said, I did find it quite tenuous.
So that was not an implication that I wanted the audience to make, because, and factually, that implication doesn't hold, because in the podcast, I make it quite explicit that the telex machines and the basic operations rooms were already brought to Latin America before Cybersyn.
Oh, yeah.
So it's not that Cybersyn had to lead to Operation Condor, it's that all of the ingredients that then were repackaged during Operation Condor were already in existence and present in the region, supplied there by the United States government by and large, in a way that was clearly known to Allende's enemies, but wasn't known, at least to my knowledge, to anybody participating in Project Cybersyn. So nobody knew that Carabineros had an operations room in their building, and few people knew that they actually had telex machines interconnecting police stations in Chile before Allende even came to power. The real reason why that story, or that storyline, or that motif, which I think is a better way to phrase it, appears in the story is to again emphasize a very peculiar theme, and that theme reappears almost in every episode. It's something what I call dark tech, and it's the mobilization of technological resources and infrastructures by various powerful forces, many of them less utopian than the leftists, for their own purposes. And I explore that theme in every episode, because I know how I've written this podcast. I have like an Excel chart that if I had time, I can show you how every theme reappears in every scene, because every episode is divided into 25 or 30 themes. So it reappears throughout, and its presence in that particular episode is driven by just one consideration. It's to show that at the end of the day, there was a certain degree of naivete among the people involved in the project and in the Allende administration in general, and their counterparts in the CIA and in the military forces proved to be much more skillful at exploiting the same infrastructures, potentially even using that operations room that they had in the Carabineros building to make a momentous decision on the day of the coup, which got the Carabineros to leave La Moneda and stop defending Allende. So I can tell you why the storyline is there. The storyline, partly why I needed to do it beyond just illustrating that theme. The storyline allows me to drive a little bit of suspense and intrigue for people who don't know what ultimately happens to Fernando Flores, as to whether he makes it or not from Dawson Island and whether he survives. Because the whole story is presented in a way that, look, now they're going after Orlando Letelier, they're going after all of the other ministers. We don't know what's going to happen to Fernando, right? Again, it's not that I inserted it just because of that, but there is a function that story plays in narrative terms. There is a function that the story plays in thematic terms, and it just so happens that one of the people who did work on Project Cybersyn, Mario Grandi, did end up being interrogated by Contreras, who eventually put this whole operation in place. Nowhere in the podcast do I insinuate that Mario Grandi told Contreras about the telex machines, which Contreras knew pretty well about, probably already from mid-1960s, having been trained in America on the latest equipment that existed there.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. I'm going to pass on my second question, or you can move over to Paul.
Yeah, Paul Pangaro, current president of American Society for Cybernetics. Paul.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Peter and everyone who arranged it, and to Evgeny for spending all of this time with us. Because I'm a member of a society, and there are a number of societies represented here that you've heard names of, I wanted to circle back to an early comment you made, which is, I believe, if I'm correct, Evgeny, that you said when you started, you dove into cybernetics. And I wondered how you felt, how important it was that you understood cybernetics and how much you dove into it. And also, how did you feel that came out? Was it valuable? Was it necessary? Was it appropriate to the narrative that you've constructed in your wonderful podcast?
Sure. I mean, look, my encounter with cybernetics goes back to probably 2012, 2013, which is when I started the history of science program at Harvard. So, I mean, I did have to reopen a lot of the books and texts that I had read in the past. My interest in cybernetics has been strong and is still strong, and as is my interest in critiques of cybernetics, whether they come from obscure French philosophers like Canquem or Simondon, or whether they come from somewhere else. Some of you might know I've done a lot of work on neoliberalism and Friedrich Hayek, and for me it's been also very interesting to see the ways in which both general system theory and cybernetics eventually entered into Hayek's conception of the economy and of how society operates. You know, there is no denying that it was an important, if not the most important kind of interdisciplinary effort of the mid-20th century. And as somebody who still practices intellectual history, I find it extremely important to get to know the main actors involved and to spend time in the archives. And I continue visiting the archives, and you know, there is no.
But in terms of the podcast itself,
sure. In terms of the podcast itself, I mean, look, I didn't want to tell the story in a way that would downplay the local agendas and the interest of the Chileans who invited Stafford beer to Chile, because it would be tempting to tell it as a story of management cybernetics conquering yet another continent or yet another country with Stafford beer coming and spreading the gospel of it around the country. So I had to read much more in Chilean and Latin American history and the history of the Cold War to do justice to them. Because with all due respect to cybernetics and operational research, which was also a hugely important component of the game, much more present in Chile at the time than cybernetics, to be honest, in the 60s. If you look at who was teaching and what, it was really operational research and not cybernetics. That was the discipline du jour, so to say. It was really the economics that like shaped the broader context in which the Allende administration was nationalizing the enterprises. Like,
so
sure, they had all sorts of ideas. So, I mean, so I don't know how to answer your question, because ultimately, once you understand Stafford's viable system model, and once you understand more or less, you know, his work before that, which partly is cybernetics and partly is operational research and partly is simulation techniques.
They're not so separable, but keep going.
Well, sure, they're not, but you asked specifically about cybernetics, right? So it's hard for me to disentangle from it. So once you understand that, I'm not sure how much more I needed. I mean, I've already read the basics, right? I mean, I've spent time in McCulloch archives. I spent time in Bateson archives. I spent time like in plenty of archives. I visited 30 archives in the last 10 years. So it's not that I needed a crash course in cybernetics.
I didn't know there were 30.
It shaped. Once you've read The Brain of the Firm and understand VCM, I mean, clearly you needed to understand what Stafford Beer was proposing in Chile. Yeah. Right, but you also need to understand why it found a receptive audience, right? And why it found a receptive audience partly has to do with all sorts of factors. The fact that many of these people were studying operational research in the 60s, partly because Sigma was active in the Chilean railways and steelmaking, partly because just their managerial needs were congruent with what Stafford was proposing. I mean, the reception of cybernetics in Chile is opens you more to the political, socioeconomic context than just the study of cybernetics. So that, I guess, would be my way out of this.
Yeah, I mean, so cybernetics begat what Stafford did. Stafford begat other things, and other people were involved. And I don't mean to quibble. I do want to thank you when I say that I think it's a wonderful podcast. I think you've opened up such interest in this, and the archives that you're producing and putting online will be important to many, many communities. And I appreciate that. And with that, I'll yield.
Yes, thank you. Well, indeed, several comments that I've been receiving here about one from Jose Carlos Mariategui. I'm sorry if I just did that name no justice, but and just he was commenting on that the archive and website is a fantastic resource that shows obviously the research you've done, which is amazing in that respect, but it also incorporates foundational elements, creating a comprehensive narrative of the growth of cybernetics in Latin America and rebalancing West-centric historical narratives by giving an account of developments that occurred outside dominant regions. So I just wanted to bring that forward. And I know that also another comment from Juliana Alvarez in Brazil was observing your tour that you had in South America, which you just referenced, and whether you had any particular reflections on that in relation to cybernetics in South America today, just before we go into the next question, Jonathan.
Sure. Well, surprisingly, in Brazil and Argentina, the audiences didn't know much about Cybersyn. In Chile, for obvious reasons, they knew a little bit more. In Brazil and Argentina, I found a lot of excitement and interest in the story. Again, I must say that I served it in my particular sauce. So there was a lot of dependency theory and economics and geopolitics and current debates about AI and big tech involved. And I think that was part of the appeal. But there are politicians I met in Brazil and elsewhere that are interested in studying that experience as a way of also building their own ventures. And I discovered the national cloud computing company in Argentina. I didn't even know it existed. So their cloud computing infrastructure is in the hands of the state as opposed to relying on Amazon or Microsoft. And so, I mean, I think there will be more and more receptive audiences in the region once. And this is not a critique of Aaron Medina and the previous ways in which the story was told, but it was told in a very Chile-specific context, which of course is fine because it's a story of Chile and Unidad Popular. But I think I, for example, tried to build a stronger connection to Brazil, to show some of the connections to Cuba, to show some of the connections to the coup in Guatemala, to then link it a little bit to events in Argentina. I really tried to tell it more as a Latin American story. And it may have seemed forced, but partly I did that knowing that I will also need to talk to Brazilians and Argentinians, and I will need to be able to excite them. And so I think that bet paid off, because the key entry point for the Brazilians was not cybernetics. It was the battle against ITT, which Brazil itself lost in the early 1960s. So I guess for me, the key takeaway here that may be useful to your community is that as exciting as cybernetics is as a discipline, fighting this related sibling stories or narratives with which to serve it, with which to present it, might be a way to reach out to much bigger audiences. So, in the case of this story, I don't think I would have gotten as much positive responses that I got in Brazil and Argentina without building these connections to their own national histories of computer development or modeling or fights against big technology firms.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just a fascinating, well, it's fascinating how this conversation has evolved into the present, really. And I think Jonathan's got a kind of couple of closing questions about relevance today, which I know obviously is a key part of the whole narrative nonfiction that you've developed. So, Jonathan.
Okay, cool. And hopefully I'm coming through louder now.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Right. Yeah. So just a little bit of explanation of my background, Evgeny. I've recently retired from a corporate career, and it's through that I came to cybernetics, because I was looking for things to solve practical problems that other methodologies weren't really working or giving me everything I needed. So it's through that path I came to it. I listened to the podcast, really gripping. I was kind of walking around the house with it on radio frequency phones, guys, wanting to listen to each episode. The storytelling, the gripping aspect was great. But if I hadn't been already involved with cybernetics, the impression I would have come away with if I'd only listened to the podcast was that it's maybe not that useful, bit niche, not relevant to today's problems, which of course is different from my own experience. So the question I've got is, that impression I've taken, I'm sure other people have taken that too. Does that surprise you?
No, it doesn't. I mean, about my podcast or about the way in which cybernetics appears, it almost doesn't appear. I mean, and it doesn't appear by design. Again, you have to understand that these are not oversights. I mean, I literally, like, when you write 12 versions of a script, believe me, you think about every single possible decision, where to put characters, how many minutes to put on each storyline, where to introduce characters, what storylines to eliminate. Like, all of that has been thought through, including how much what's known as exposition do I do. Because me explaining cybernetics and what it means, I had plenty of material for it. I was planning for it. I've interviewed many people on this call. I interviewed Paul Pangaro about cybernetics. I've interviewed, Peter Gallison. I've interviewed many people who could speak historically, analytically, sociologically about what cybernetics was, what it does, etc. It's just that I couldn't find the right entry point into that story, and I had to basically make a decision. What exposition I want to make? Do I want to make an exposition about the Chilean political context? Well, I'll explain that Unidad Popular had 6 parties. Will I explain the context of the Cold War, or will I explain cybernetics? If I had mentioned all 3, I would have lost half of the audience in episode 1. Right, or episode 2. So for me, the idea was to, for example, when I introduced Stafford beer initially, and when not the Stafford beer, when I introduced the Cybersyn and what they are planning in Chile, you will see that it appears in a very particular moment of the podcast in episode 2. I start that episode with the gathering of industrialists in Viña del Mar, which, if you look at it chronologically, happens exactly the same months that Fernando Flores meets Stafford beer in the Athenaeum Club. Right? And what happens at that meeting in Viña del Mar is that they are trying to build their own intelligence center, their own operations room, put 70 people there, and monitor the Chilean economy to find ways to destabilize it. Right, so there is an active effort to basically make sure the situation that these things fall apart for Allende. Right, and it's against that context then I introduce Project Cybersyn as an effort to stabilize the economy against an ongoing effort to destabilize it. Right, it doesn't necessarily present cybernetics, the idea of homeostasis, equilibrium, nothing. It's all hidden, right? But the idea that I wanted people to go away with is that, oh, look, it was an effort to use computers and tools of management to bring some order and management to what otherwise was an artificially destabilized system, right? So there was an effort to build, I don't know what, if you in this context you have come up with the right opposite word to synergy, but whatever it is, they were doing cybernetic dyssynergy, right? And it was a systematic project to do it. And for me, Cybersyn appears as an answer to that. And, and I fully get that maybe people involved in the project, including Stafford, Raul, and Fernando, were not totally aware of all those efforts to destabilize the situation. But with hindsight, we can say that it was, right? So in my case, again, I think that here, the strategy and the bet that I made is that people will love the material, they will go online, they will search for Stafford beer, they will search for Project Cybersyn, they will search for cybernetics, and they will enter the story, right? So if you look at the website, there is a page explaining cybernetics on the website, I think, and there is a page explaining management cybernetics, and there are this, what I call them episode context bits, which are supposed to give you a little bit more, right? But here, one has to approach it with a distribution of labor, of work of some kind. What are the kind of stories and storylines and teasers you can put into the audio, and which parts of the story you can keep on the website so that people who want more can go and explore it by watching Stafford beer himself explaining some of it in a video lecture that he gave in 1973, right? It's a set of trade-offs. But again, I think it would be misleading to think about this only as the podcast and leave the part with all of the source materials and extra explanations and extra pointers that exist online on the website.
Thank you. Let me thank you myself for all the work you've done and for being here today. And thank you for the opportunity to do a little bit of moderating here. And let me hand it back to Angela and John.
Thank you, Peter, but we have the final question from Marcus Schoeninger.
Oh, okay, I didn't see that.
Yes, well, I think in your last words, you have very well shown the aspect of what could be the influence of this project on the attitude towards cybernetics and the knowledge of cybernetics among a bigger public. Now, I would like to hear, in addition from you, I think you have to say something about that. What concretely could be the relevance of system or of Cybersyn today in the context of the many crises we are facing and the available technology? Do you think there are things in this approach of cybernetics that could be useful in transformative projects which could benefit from it in the future?
Sure. I mean, this is where, I mean, I'll answer your question, but I'll have to answer it by separating between the abstract kind of VSM-driven setup of Cybersyn from the actual specific concrete implementation of it to manage nationalized enterprises in Chile. So clearly, I don't think that it's the only tool available for managing nationalized enterprises, and there are very few governments that are still nationalizing them, at least to the same in the same way as governments of 1960s and 1970s were doing. So, you know, when the French government nationalizes an energy firm, they still run it pretty much as a private, as a company, and they don't have an entity like Corfo, which sits and decides how you can coordinate the activities of all the companies that are state-owned in the energy sector. That, as far as I know, doesn't happen. So the utility of Cybersyn as a specific project geared towards better running a state-run sector of the economy, I think, is limited because the economics has changed dramatically. If we suddenly return to import substitution, industrialization, and dependency theory and structural economics, and CIPAL will be more important than Montpellierin society that, you know, promotes the neoliberal agenda, I think that would force me to reconsider the answer about the specifics. On the kind of broader abstract level, I mean, there is, I do think that the work of trying to turn in the VSM itself into kind of a diagnostic as well as a recipe for how to run effective and potentially federated organizations, it's extremely useful, and that's the part of it that I would think harder about. How do we build cloud computing systems or artificial intelligence systems which bring different actors together and allow them to coordinate in a more efficient way and in a more productive way? And, you know, we do know that VSM offers some of those tools and methods and methodologies, and John and Angela and many others have been writing about that quite extensively in different contexts, right, from cooperatives to health and bureaucracy. The extent to which we should draw the equivalence between VSM and Cybersyn, it's not up to me to decide. You know, I'm really an observer in this. The extent to which we can recover small parts of Cybersyn that did not receive a lot of attention in my podcast, for example, the economic modeling and Checo, I talk very little about it. Again, because my impression was it was a relatively marginal part of the project. And that was the impression reinforced, including by people who worked in it, like Mario Grandi. That definitely has an interesting life, but it wasn't a unique approach to modeling the economy, right? And it wasn't the pioneering approach to modeling the economy either. And this is why, to really understand the uniqueness of certain components of Cybersyn, both the operations room and Checo model of the economy, we really need a comparative study of uptake of these tools and methodologies in Latin America. That's why, to really understand the uniqueness and novelty of something like Checo, the model of the Chilean economy, you really need to read that against the work of Oscar Warszawski in Venezuela and Argentina and Peru that was happening throughout late 1960s. So then you would understand. So, I mean, that doesn't mean that the economic modeling and climate modeling has no future. I would just be cautious against attributing those parts as uniquely novel contributions of Cybersyn itself.
Okay, you have a lot of work ahead, and we all have
a lot of work ahead, not me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much for hosting me. It's been a pleasure.
Peter, let me just thank Eugene, and I will be giving my opinions this Friday.
Sure.
Particularly, I will be connecting the VSM with Cybersyn, and that's what I think, thank God, Eugene was pointing at the end of his talk. But thank you.
Sure. And unfortunately, I'll be on a flight on a Friday evening going to Vienna from Venezia, but I will watch the video afterwards, Raul. I won't be able to join it, unfortunately.
Terrible. I thought you were going to be there.
Well, I'll send. I can send an avatar that will still ask some questions.
Anyway, well, I can only thank all of you, all the people in the panel for their contributions. Evgeny, obviously, for his amazingly interesting podcast. I think that it has attracted a lot of attention and definitely a very impressive work. And invite all of you to come to listen to Raul. Raul as the main person leading the Cybersyn project in Chile will give us his own experience and his own perspectives, which is gonna be very interesting to hear and to debate following this. And then we will have a final webinar on the Cybersyn project in December. This will be a film screening that Jose Carlos Mariategui and Bassam Al-Bassami are going to be showing to us. And it's more thinking about the future of how the Cybersyn project will be useful to influence the current society and the future of the human society. So we hope that this conversation will continue. I will invite Evgeny to continue getting in these conversations as part of the community. We are going to create a way of continuing the conversation for those interested. We will send an email to those that came to this webinar explaining how to continue the conversation in a platform that we are prototyping. So hopefully we will be able to continue this conversation and learn together. There's a lot of things to learn. So many thanks to all of you, and thanks for staying late. Thanks to Peter for facilitating, and to James for being in the background. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you, Evgeny.